We're going to be talking about Chapter 1. Now, before I get started, I would like to mention that this is going to be sort of a lecture based on Chapter 1. It's a bit more condensed than the full chapter, so I please encourage you to read Chapter 1 and refer to these videos that I do on a weekly basis as sort of a supplement to the information that is in the textbook. The definitions that I pull from will be from the textbook because sometimes definitions can have different meanings for different things. So what I'm going to be referencing is going to be based on the material from the textbook. Some words may be more expansive, but we're just going to be focusing on this. Okay, so starting off, what is art? Art is a very big topic, and trying to describe it in one sentence or two is pretty difficult to do. But according to the textbook, they define art as this. It is a way in which we can describe what an object is and how we categorize it with other works of art. And that can mean a lot of different things. Art throughout the ages has had different uses. There has been different relationships between people and the artwork that they look at. It may be based in religion and ritual. It may be based on information. Art is a human phenomenon. And when we talk about art, especially how we're going to think about art, we're going to think about it as someone who lives in a Western culture and in the 21st century. And in our culture, we see art as a visual medium that is used to express ideas about the human experience and the world around us. Art can be very different, like I've shown you. It can be whatever society or culture says is art. It's not universal and it is not fixed. And it can fluctuate because cultures are alive and constantly in a state of change. Art has lots of functions. And some of these functions we're going to go over later on in the semester. But we can talk about art in many different ways. Beyond just being an expressive creation, art can also have a function in assisting rituals. It can reflect customs. It can communicate ideas, anything from scientific knowledge to spiritual knowledge to hidden knowledge. They can hide codes in it as well. It can help us imagine the divine and what it is to experience the supernatural. It can commemorate the dead and keep their memory alive through those that have still remembered them. The art can be made to glorify the state and to sort of bolster its authority over its citizens. Artwork can be for protests, political and social. It can celebrate war and conquest. They can be created to promote cohesion within society. Other ways, it can also be simple, and that can record likenesses. Art has always been about looking at other people, and thus the figure, the face, what it looks like. What does, an earl look like? Or what does an old relative from centuries gone by? Right? An old dusty photograph from some relative you've never known, never heard of, but there they are looking at you, right through the camera and right to you. It can educate us. It can show us illustrations. Looking at a biology book, an anatomy book, obviously conveys a lot of dense information. And also, it can entertain us. It can open us up to new worlds, new explorations, new ideas, to experience things from the safety of our own couch, at a movie theater, when you're going out and socializing with friends. Art is around us and it surrounds us on a day-to-day basis. But bringing it back, we have to sort of talk about art in sort of very specific ways. And a good way to talk about that is through talking about its visual form. basically what the thing looks like. How do we interact with it? How do we experience it? And what is that we are actually experiencing? We talk about this by going through the visual form. The visual form has several different type of elements. You have the formal elements, very simple. Line, shape, color, texture, mass, volume, space. All right? That's what it's made of. What colors are there? How does it look? Composition is sort of the arrangement of those elements. Right? Are the colors bright? Are they muted? Is it tall? Is it big? Is it small? Right? And then what are the materials from the artwork in which it's made? Is it painting? Is it oil? Is it painted on canvas? Is it painted on tin cans? Is it just Coke bottles? Right? All these things can change and are sort of available for artists to create artwork. Artwork can have different functions in different forms. And so this is an example where two pieces of artwork have relatively the same function, but they have different forms in which that function plays out. On the left, we have a Nigerian sculpture, and on the right, you have, a sculpture as well, but this is from Marcus Aurelius, a Roman ruler. And so they're both glorifying the rulers. They're both, designed to uplift their image, but they're doing it in very, very distinct and specific ways. The content is the same. They're both rulers, right? This content, basically what we're looking at, is described through several different things, such as the imagery. Imagery is being what we're looking at. We're seeing this sort of Roman ruler. We see that he's wearing the clothes of a Caesar. You have sort of his demeanor. You see him on a horse, right? But all of those things have symbolic meanings. Customs, beliefs, and values of the culture is expressed through this type of content. And then there are also writings that explain the work. Scholars, newspapers, other people. Maybe there's an inscription nearby where it describes what a person is looking at. If they're just walking through the area and come upon this thing and they're not quite sure what they're looking at. Those writings can help people understand what they're looking at. The difference can also be between, if you look on the left, the other sculpture is made out of wood. It's made out of common materials. It's relatively small. The figures themselves are a lot more sort of abstracted and a lot more expressive. And another thing that's really interesting is how it's used. It's made out of wood, right? It's 71 inches high, so it's somewhat tall, but it can also be moved, right? It's placed on the floor where people can get up close and to touch it, where they can interact with it. It kind of is in place of rulers or in place of the specific ancestors that are no longer with us. It kind of stays there and kind of embodies that spirit. Whereas on the right, you have this statue, which is made out of very strong, hard materials. It's up on sort of a plinth. It is sort of high and it commands over the citizenry below. The horse kind of almost has an aggressive face. It is seen to be a little bit more domineering, a little bit more further away. You can't touch this figure. You can't really connect with this figure. This figure looms over you. And so the relationships are completely different, even though they are sort of describing that same sort of thing. And so art has content, right? Content is a fancy way of saying, what does it mean? How are you supposed to understand these type of things? Some content can be obvious and some can be hidden. This here is a fresco of the birth of Venus. Very, very famous fresco painting. Is this painting that is basically part of a plaster wall. And it's very beautiful as well as very durable. It was created back in the 15th century. And so the funny thing is when you have a long enough span of time, sometimes those connections can be lost from the original intent of the artist. While we can kind of make a lot of suggestions, some of the actual details are not really defined. So Venus, obviously the goddess of beauty, standing right there in the clamshell. That coast up over there definitely relates to the geography. You have the olive trees. But you also sort of have these two figures here on the left, right? This, we think it may be Zephyr, but we're not quite sure. We're not sure which god this is. And we have sort of the woman clinging to his side. Not completely 100% sure, right? The woman over here onto the right, we're not sure either, but several interpretations have placed it as she is sort of the embodiment of Italian culture. Maybe you have the embodiment of a nation. She's carrying this big sort of what looks like a flag to drape over her body. And so sometimes art can be obvious, some of it can be hidden. Sometimes artwork can reflect culture the moment it was made. This painting by Pablo Picasso was made during the modern era. Pablo Picasso was a traditionally trained artist. He started very young. He was considered a prodigy. He was able to emulate the masters of time of antiquity. So basically a very classical sort of sense of drawing, art things. Especially in the 19th century, art was considered beautiful, wonderful paintings that look like freshly rendered, almost lifelike interpretations on painted canvases, and it's depicting something that happened with gods or goddesses, tales from the Bible, those type of things. Now he goes and grows up in this type of institution. Most art was kind of shown in what's called gallery shows. These gallery shows were from basically what they call the art salon. Art salons were basically artists who would, paint something within 5 genres: landscapes, people in portraits. You have animals. You have, you would have tales from the Bible, and just basically several different categories. And if it didn't fit in that categories, it was sort of kicked out. And art was crammed together, no space given to one another. It was all sort of like this merit points. Who can make something look as good as this? Who can make something look good as that? But it wasn't really expressing anything. He found that to be stifling and constricting, and it was terrible. So he wanted to take something, a new piece of artwork that was actually expressing an idea rather than replicating something from the past. And so here he is, Pablo Picasso is making this painting, the Women's of Avalon, and you have this sort of painting over, you look over here on your left, where you have the Venus, right? The birth of Venus. You kind of have a similar situation, right? You have kind of the same figures. He's kind of already drawing a connection. You have a central figure, a woman in the middle, right? Surrounded by other figures, right? They're naked, right? Because that is sort of a beauty, but their bodies are really not beautiful. They're disjointed, they're twisted, they're kind of not quite exactly right. Their bodies are sort of shaken, their eyes are hollow. And this is also just kind of reflects upon other sort of ideas of what Europe was really sort of dealing with, especially with the 18th and 19th century being particularly a brutal time for the world. Other things that he was interested by was also the idea of masks. So he's now looking beyond just European ideas of what's beautiful and what is sort of considered art, and he's kind of expanding his idea. And over here he's looking at a ceremonial mask, right? And he sees these type of masks as something that someone would don on and a spirit would sort of possess the person who's wearing it. And so it looks like the people are wearing masks, if you look at the painting on the right. And he's sort of saying, this painting here of these women are not actually the women. Gods and goddesses, stories from the Bible, but not the people themselves. And so this was sort of his artwork that he created. There's a lot more that goes beyond it, but needless to say, this thing shook up the artistic establishment. This was sort of the birth of what we considered what we've been talking about. 20th century, 21st century art is all about expression. It's about being something and creating something and making something novel, something fresh, something that people have not seen before. It may be disturbing, and this was sort of the thing that kind of started it. It wasn't the first, but this was sort of that shifting point, that tilting point that started to kind of push people into the idea of modern thinking of painting. Aesthetics. So aesthetics is really just philosophy. There's a lot of different types of philosophies. There's through many different ideas, how we learn, how we speak, how we work as a society, how does a government work. There's all these sort of different philosophies that can be applied to things. And aesthetics is a philosophy. It is a branch of philosophy that deals with art, the sources, where does art draw its inspiration from? What forms does it take and its effects and affects on the viewer? Sometimes it goes beyond just to individual tastes or preferences. It goes beyond just what something looks like and whether or not it looks good or bad through some sort of arbitrary thing, but rather understanding why it looks the way it looks. And is it effective? And also, it is a critical reflection on art. You're being a critic, and it's not saying you're just being negative about an artwork and saying this is bad, this is good, without really saying why. Being critical is really sort of diving into and understanding and pulling apart the tiny little pieces that make a piece of artwork come together. And then you can use that to reflect on what does this mean, not only about the artwork, but what does this actually mean about culture in large. Creating art. Creating art, as defined by the textbook, and I don't fully agree with it because as an artist myself, there's many different approaches. But this is a pretty good general approach to modern art and or just contemporary art. And it really comes in through 3 stages. The first stage is perception. An artist is sort of looking around, trying to find inspiration. Where is that great idea for my next great painting going to come from? I'm not sure what it's going to be, but it's going to be somewhere around me, or it's going to be within me. But I got to get that spark, that sort of look of something. And then there's the response. That's the moment when they come up with either an idea, they go, oh, they can respond to anything that's around them. Maybe something they're responding to politics. Maybe they're responding to family dynamics. Maybe they're responding to something that's very beautiful that's in front of them. And then they make the expression. The expression is the art that comes from that response, right? I am going to express my love for the sunrise by painting a sunrise. I'm going to respond by a terrible headline I saw in the newspaper by making this bold, brash painting, right? So art kind of follows, and art and creation follows that sort of form. Some artwork is not really about the final product itself, but it's about the act of creation. Zen stone gardens, while they are aesthetically beautiful and they can be very calming and they can be very sort of pleasing to the eye, the actual beauty from these gardens comes from not the actual space, but the sort of meditative state you put yourself in while you are creating these gardens, right? The drawing of the rake. Every day you kind of sweep out all of the debris, smooth out all of the rocks, and then go back with sort of a rake and create patterns in the sand. It's all sort of a form of meditation in and of itself, and it really doesn't matter because you're going to have to do it over the next day. And so the process is really important, not so much the output. So sometimes when it comes to creating art, maybe it's not the final form. Maybe it is the person and how they feel when they get to the creative parts. There are some artists who just like to make paintings. They don't care if it looks good or not, but they find joy in just pulling out the supplies, spending a few moments where they can just clear their mind and kind of focus on what's in front of them. So sometimes, again, art isn't always about the final piece. And another thing is we really talk about is creativity. Right? An artist's creativity, their genius to do something different, to create an object that doesn't exist, and they bring it into being. right? This is exactly what, especially in the 20th century and 21st century, really sort of kind of hoist above most other things, right? Some kind of idea that is novel, that is brash, something that makes a statement that stands out, right? Sometimes in other cultures, it may not always be that way, but particularly in our area, our neck of the woods, during our time, that's kind of what we're looking at. Today in the United States, creativity has pretty much two essential ingredients: innovation and self-expression. Art is often innovative and unique, while at the same time can borrow from existing styles and symbols. Art may not be the same in all cultures. The art of the masquerade is incredibly important on the continent of Africa, but in North America, it's not so much. And there's not, through one fault or another, that's just a sort of different perception and a different cultural value that we assign to that type of art or craft. There are also different categories of visual art, sometimes called art movements, sometimes called art genres, and here's a few of them that we're going to sort of explore in this textbook. We have pop art. Pop art is basically art that references pop culture, what we see on the television, what we see in social media, what we see in music, what we experience as sort of the sort of heartbeat, the nerve center of what culture is sort of experiencing at that moment, at that time. Viewers tend to be inundated with images and objects rather than fully rendered paintings. Some images can be considered art, some can be considered pop culture, or lowbrow, or just kind of commercial expresses, like something that was made by an anonymous graphic designer, such as an advertisement. That can be considered sort of more pop culture, where maybe it could be an artist who makes a painting that sort of references pop culture, right? And some of them combine both. Takashi Murakami is a Japanese artist, and he makes a lot of pop culture work that sort of criticizes, talks about, and sort of responds to the pop culture of Japanese pop culture. How many times I'm going to say pop culture? I don't know, but I'll keep saying it. But his work, again, much like Pablo Picasso, is influenced by those that came before him. And so Murakami is not just interested in making artwork that talks about pop culture and sort of kind of, talks about imagery that includes things such as anime and manga that's going on, sort of the culture that's there, but also other sort of issues. But he also uses imagery that is very bright, hypercolor. You're looking at something that is a covering of 5 to 25 different layers of ink that he lays down. A very sort of traditional process that's linked to early Japanese woodblock printing techniques, which we will talk about later. But he applies it to sort of a new aesthetic, right? He takes old ideas and reimagines it and relays it into a new one. In the same way that Pablo Picasso did the women of Avalon to sort of the older painting of the sort of Birth of Venus, you have him kind of taking older Japanese artworks and applying it to pop culture and sort of more contemporary references. His work is very bold, very stylish, and a lot of times he's also commissioned by artists to sort of make things for him. And he's a commercial artist as well. And so in this example, this is the original not painting, but print that was made for Kanye West's one of his albums. But his work is not just limited to just a print. Pop culture can sort of be very expansive and be very creative and experimental. And here he's taking these large sort of murals on the sides here. These are made out of silk, right? So it's kind of referencing Japanese silk prints that were very popular and are still very popular, where it's the textiles and textures, right? And you also have sort of references to graffiti in the center here, right? And again, cultural issues. These sort of flowers here are an interesting motif, a design signature that he includes into a lot of his work. And in this one over here, it almost is sort of an explosion of flowers, but for him, he's actually referencing his anxieties of growing up in Japan after World War II in the 60s and 70s, where the looming danger of the nuclear bombs that were dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki still kind of played into the culture, especially their anxieties for catastrophe. And his artwork can still sort of express those types of things. And his work is massive and it's huge. And he's using these images to sort of, again, reference traditional Japanese printmaking and referencing traditional Japanese motifs, but he's recreating it. These are all sort of pop cultural examples of how his work can be slotted into that genre of work. And you can, again, this is some of his references. Hokusai was a Japanese printmaker. And so, again, you have sort of the same imagery. Notice how you got this sort of dragon and caricature. It's very similar to in this painting. And again, Mount Fuji, clouds, very stylized. Right? And so it's a very interesting sort of way to think about art. We'll just skip that. There are other categories of art. Art isn't always just painting and sculpture and stuff that's kind of sit around to only look at as pleasing objects. There's other artwork that we have, and more as time goes on, it's being recognized. And one of those types of art is what we call crafts. Sometimes they're distinguished separately from art, but we're starting to see more integration of textiles, fiber arts, and what would be considered crafts to be included in artwork in art galleries at large. This rug here is an example of an object that can be classified as a fine art or as a craft. Sometimes the examples that considered distinguished in high quality and seem to have sort of a sense of high skill to create, well, I mean, that takes as much effort as being a painter, doesn't it? So why should we not consider it on the same level as a beautiful painting or a wonderful photograph? But when we talk about crafts, there still is a distinguishing difference between craft and artwork. Craft can sometimes refer to specific media, such as ceramics, glass, jewelry, weaving, and woodworking. It usually involves making objects rather than images. A painting is not just because it's a painting, but because that painting looks like something. It expresses something in a visual form, but that's pretty much all there is to it. Crafting usually has a transformation of a material into something else. Usually they have a utilitarian purpose. So a rug, very beautiful, but it's still a rug. It's something that people lay down to sort of walk on top of. It's jewelry. It's something to wear. Crafts such as ceramics and glass may actually have an actual purpose, such as to carry someone's tea, or windows, like a stained glass windows out on the Notre Dame. It's beautiful, but it's also functional as well, so to keep the elements from coming in to the sanctuary. There's also other ways we can think about art, and we're talking about stylistic categories. A stylistic category is sort of a manner of artistic expression. An individual artist, it could be talking about a historical period or of an entire civilization. You can apply it to as big or as small as you'd like, as long as you kind of set the description to appropriately describe it in an adequate way. A rose can be a rose, but styles of representation are not always the same. If you look at the top, it's a photograph, and at the bottom, it's also a photograph. Two different photographers photographing relatively the same subject matter, two flowers, but they've done it in a very different way. The photograph on top is very literal. The person just kind of got real close. They chose to get real close, got lots of colors into it, and it's all about sort of expressing the vibrancy of what they see. The bottom photograph, it looks like the photographer used a more traditional approach. They photograph it in black and white. They give it a tint process. And so it's not so much about photographing what they see, but maybe transferring that photograph from what they see into what they feel. And both artists are doing this, and they do that through their stylistic choices. Stylistic vocabulary. There are lots of different ways that we can talk about art. And again, vocabulary is incredibly important. And when I say stylistic vocabulary, vocabulary is very important, and it makes it much easier to understand concepts. And so when we say a certain definition, it's so we all can kind of understand what that means. Style vocabulary. There are some words that we use to describe paintings, to describe art in general. And here are just a few of them that we're going to go over to begin with. This is just sort of a small little size of that vocabulary. It'll expand beyond that. But for right now, we'll focus on sort of the key kind of vocabulary. First one is naturalistic. Naturalistic is artwork that is very recognizable. It depicts scenes that you see in nature. Right? Here's a flower. Here's a landscape. Here's something that is recognizable as something. Representational contains entities from the world in a recognizable form. It represents something. It means something that is an object that represents an actual person. This is your aunt. This is your uncle. This is your father. This is your son. That kind of thing. It represents a tangible person. Artwork that's idealized is a little something different. It's sort of natural in its representation. It's still recognizable, right? So over here in the sculpture of Apollo, I believe, right? And he's throwing a discus, or this Olympian or whatever. He's naturalistic in a way, right? You can recognize the body, but it is idealized. It's not one person, but rather an idealization of what the human body could look like. It is modified. It strives for perfection, the boundaries and values of aesthetics of a particular culture. So the Greeks were obsessed with sort of aesthetics, and the more idealized the beauty is, the more perfect it can be. That's why the gods were always depicted as having perfect bodies, because that was their idealization of what the human body could be. Not exactly realistic, but that's what they idealized. Classical art is art that is orderly, it is balanced, it is clear in proportion. This artwork usually describes a point in the evolution of styles and represents the full development of a certain style. When we talk about that, we're talking about the style of the collective artists at the time. The artists weren't interested in making a name for themselves for having drastically different styles from one another. They all were trying to emulate the same thing. And when you look at that kind of classical art, we're really more talking about, classical art is art that can be defined as being orderly, balanced, clear, and well proportioned. It can describe a point in the evolution of styles, and it represents the full development of a certain style that we do call classical art. This refers specifically to art made in Greece during the 5th century. And when we talk about full development of a certain style, the concentration and the ideas that the artists were trying to do were making art in the tradition of their own masters. Artists at the time weren't interested in making something drastically different or talking about art that would make things different and radically, changing, right? It's all very sort of traditional, very sort of conservative in their approach to artwork. Whereas another type of style vocabulary, we have expressive or expressionistic style of art. This is a mid-20th century art movement that came kind of on the heels during the Cold War. And this was sort of the emergence of psychology, the emergence of the individual, the idea that the artist is a master of what they feel and creating things that have never been seen before and to sort of shake things up. And they were more interested in creating artwork that was about emotions. They were interested in making unknown and unexpected changes. They appear bold, immediate. These features are distorted. It can be abstracted imagery, which is artwork that doesn't really supposed to look like anything in particular. It's just a mess, right? It's non-objective, right? It can appear symmetrical. It can be anything that it could possibly be created by the artist, using whatever means necessary to create something new and something novel. They tend to have textured surfaces, thick paint applications that seem to be kind of rising up and rising out from the canvas and precariously about to drop to the floor. And so they were really interested in creating really vibrant, really stylistic stuff. And so you can compare and contrast a decade apart what happened in society, going through all of that crazy change that set up what would then be sort of the turbulent 60s. But during the 50s, this sort of Jackson Pollock, if you look at the left here, his work, again, abstract expressionism, all about sort of making the crazy, wild paintings that were, heralded as being a genius and heralded as being new and expressive and this sort of great stuff. After about 10 years or so, you had sort of another artwork that kind of calls a response to Jackson Pollock's splatter paintings, and that would be Andy Warhol. So Andy Warhol was a graphic designer originally, and he was really interested in the objects that were manufactured. His idea is that the artwork was no longer the culture. The Jackson Pollock paintings and all these sort of crazy Rothko paintings that were these blobs of colors that were massive in size and were incredibly expensive, expenses that people would never see before, but were like considered almost simple, right? Just stuff flown on a canvas. I could have done it. And so he kind of says, you know what? That's now disconnected from culture. The real culture is going to the supermarket. You want to go experience what culture is like for mid-century Americans in the 20th century? Go to the supermarket. That's where you'll find your culture. That's where you'll find your high art. And his work is actually very interesting because he mass-produced them in a way where he never touched his artwork. He would have other people do the artwork for him. He was like an art director. And it was very much on purpose to be a contrast between Jackson Pollock and his sort of type of artist, where they were all about the hands or all about the movement, that the artist is so much sort of imbued within the artwork that it actually, the artist's genius is somehow left as residue on the canvas. Right? And so Andy Warhol's like, that's nonsense. Here's art. It's a Campbell soup can. It's not coming from some dude splattering paint on a canvas. So it's kind of an interesting thing. Other types of art, we have the Surrealists. Now, the interesting thing, the Surrealist was a very long-running category of art. It started early in the 20th century, and it lasted until the 1970s. So it has a very deep history, and it has a lot of sort of really different interesting ideas that influenced other art movements. And so it is featured a lot in this textbook, although I'm afraid it may be just a little bit too much, but hey, you know what? Who am I to argue with the textbook? So we will talk a little bit about the Surrealists, and they do have some really interesting and neat ideas. Mainly, their idea to take what would be recognizable forms of the world around us and twisting it, contorting it and making it bizarre. Right? So surreal refers to art that is bizarre, it has fantastical arrangements of the images and materials, and it sort of taps into the unconscious mind. They were very interested in sort of creating things that are recognizable, but it also feels like a strange dream. Right? So Leonora Carrington, very prominent surrealist. Her paintings sort of deal with migration, with sort of um, people that sort of are powerful, who are twisted by the power that they hold, the creatures, the landscapes. And there's all these this sort of same sort of motifs that go on in the works. One thing that surrealists are known for doing is taking things that are somewhat recognizable but not quite. It's like when you're in a dream and you tried to read a book but the words just keep falling off the page. It's recognizable but there's something odd. This mountain is a mountain made out of rocks but there's something odd. This sort of land in the distance has mountains and it has hills and it has streams, but there's something odd. The creatures are familiar but odd. There's something strange going on here and something strange going on there. And it all sort of kind of dives into the idea of psychology, especially the human subconscious. Especially surrealists were very interested in sort of the untapped creativity of the subconscious mind. The dreaming world was pretty much their muse, to put it simply. And so it led to a lot of painters kind of making these odd, strange, twisted paintings. And they're kind of fun and they can be psychological and they can also be playful. So, yeah, the Surrealists are very interesting and has a wide variety of work as an art movement. I mentioned earlier about abstracted art. So there's two different ways that we can talk about abstract art. Abstract art and non-objective art sometimes get kind of smushed together. Abstract art can be artwork that could be, say I'm making a painting of an apple. The apple looks like an apple. It kind of looks like how it should, and it seems to be in the size that it needs to be. But let's just say I distort it, make it bigger, make it squishier, make it much like how the surrealists, let's say, make it look like it's melting or kind of splattering it around to where it's almost unrecognizable. That's abstracting an object. But when you have non-objective art actually is a painting of nothing in particular. The artist didn't start with an apple and then make drastic changes to its appearance. They're really more interested in just what colors look like on a canvas. Frank Stella is an artist who is very interested in creating optical illusions with his artwork. It's not that he's making paintings that look like something, he's just making paintings of ideas. He's making paintings of these strange shapes and strange color contrasts that make your eyes kind of, spaz out a little, and it makes it strange effect to the viewer. So it's a very important distinction between abstract art and non-objective abstract art, right? Abstracted imagery may not be recognizable, but it is derived from reality by distorting, whereas non-objective art is not. This is Georgia O'Keeffe, 20th century painter. Her work immensely popular. And what she would do, she would take everyday life, living out in the Southwest, and she would make an abstract. This is her painting after reacting to flying in an airplane. Looking down below over the ocean, she can see these little clouds. It's kind of recognizable as clouds, right? You have a horizon line. You have this sort of gradient that looks like a sky. You have these things down below. They kind of look like clouds, but she didn't actually paint these things to look like clouds. She just abstracted their forms to the simplest description. But it's an abstraction. Morris Louis, on the other hand, was creating non-objective art. And he's still making abstract art, but what he's doing, he's putting paint. And what he does is he takes this big, huge canvas, and this is a massive canvas, and he basically puts paint right on the edge here, and will tilt the canvas, and then will pour paint down the canvas and let it spill through the canvas, creating all of these strange and unusual patterns. But he's not actually trying to make it look like anything else than paint on a canvas. That's the big distinction between abstraction and non-objective art. Cultural styles are basically differences when it comes to describing the same thing. They can have objects that can be described differently. That's basically the same thing, but another way to say it is that different cultures can describe the same thing in different ways. One way we can see this happening is through Islamic mosques. Um, Islamic mosques are built the same way as it is described in the Quran. They all sort of have the same chambers. They have the same structures. They have basically what is supposed to be a mosque. But each culture takes it a little bit differently. Islam is a religion that is worldwide, and so it's very interesting to see how different countries and different societies and cultures through time has sort of changed what they could look like. You have the Great Mosque in Mali, which is made out of materials that are around the land. It's just this hard packed clay. It uses wood. It uses these natural materials. It was built, right, to sort of basically reflect what the society at the time felt would be appropriate, what would make for a great mosque for the community. Whereas if you look at the mosque that was built in Pakistan, it's made out of marble. It takes centuries to create. It is big, it is grand, it is a different way that they want the mosque to integrate into the society. So they're built relatively supposed to be the same thing, but their cultures express it in different ways. And then we also have individual artistic style. This can refer to the distinguishing characteristics of an artist's work. And so notice the similarities and differences between Paul Gauguin and Vincent van Gogh, his paintings of Madame Junot. Vincent van Gogh and Gauguin were both sort of buddies, and they kind of rented a room at Madame Junot's hotel. And these two artists are depicting the same woman. Van Gogh is on the left, Gauguin is on the right. And notice how, while the subject is the same, they've decided to do it a little bit different. And it's not just different just because one artist is a different way of depicting Junot herself, but notice also the colors that are used. Van Gogh's are very drab on the colors. They're very monochromatic, right? It's all yellows, it's blacks, and it's browns. Gauguin, on the other hand, is bright. You see reds, you see greens. Notice what's in front of the table is completely different. The sort of backdrop is completely different. Van Gogh, it's completely empty. Gauguin decided to create, the background with a, billiard table and other patrons. Right? There's another painting on the wall. There's a cat at the bottom, right? So it seems to tell a little bit more about setting and place. But this is all about the different artists' individual style. The first paintings were completed within an hour during a single sitting, painted on burlap canvas, and then Van Gogh would go back up into his studio and then basically repainted it once more on a more expensive and much larger canvas. A few years later, not actually too much further into the future, Van Gogh was basically off in Arles, and he was sort of kind of committed because he was going through a lot of psychological issues. And so he was sort of kind of cooped up and wasn't really allowed to go anywhere. And so he and Gauguin were, we keep in touch through letters, and Van Gogh was bored out of his mind and says, Gauguin, can you please send me anything and everything? I need to have ideas to sketch. And so he sends the original sketch of Madame Junot, the one that he made, right? If you can remember that. And so he sends it to Van Gogh, and Van Gogh takes Gauguin's original sketch and recreates his painting. And notice it's, again, very different. He's playing with styles. The books change, her dress change, the backdrop changes. In total, he made about 6 paintings. 4 of them survive. 2 of them ended up missing in the mail. One of them was originally supposed to be given to Madame Junot as a gift, but ended up being missing. But it's a very interesting sort of way to look at and kind of understand how different artists can have their own individual expressive style. And so that brings me to this week's response. And what do you think is art? If you go and follow on to the week 2 chapter discussion, you can enter your own answer to this question. What is art? Write about 100 words, 200 words, it doesn't have to be much. Please be sure to include any sort of images you would like to put into it. But what does art mean to you? What does it do to you? Is it a part of your everyday life? Is it something you can't live without? Is it, something you surround yourself with books, media, music? Or is it just something that you've never really had a part of? Maybe it's something that you sort of find distinctly foreign. There's nothing wrong with that. What is your relationship with art? Your responses will be due by next Tuesday. Will actually be Monday at midnight. So that would make it Tuesday morning. Next week it will be a holiday, so you guys will not be given new materials until Tuesday. And I should have all the previous week's questions answered by midweek. Again, if you guys have any questions, please get in touch with me. So this concludes this part of the lecture. And next week we will go over the Chapter 2. So please read ahead if you'd like, and we'll move on to that next. Until then, guys, have yourself a great and safe week.